Compass Publishing.
Good morning from South Korea, from Seoul. My name is Roger Fusselman. I'm very happy to see everyone here. Just to give a few shout-outs, we have people such as Luis Pro Año. I hope I said that right. Luis, did I pronounce your name right? We also have Soy Pise. Soy, where are you from? Where are you watching this from? Gigi Salas, Rosales Roslando, hello, hello. We have Lyra Jung. Compass Publishing is saying hello to all of you out there. And also a good hello to Sonia Elizabeth Macias Geiler. I'm learning as I go along, just as I'm sure you as teachers learn. Okay, so today we're going to jump into this particular experience. Let me give another shout out to Ana Bertha Jimenez Vargas. Great to see everyone here. Now, let's get started. A lot of what we're going to do today is related to what we're calling 21st century skills. This is an important concept that teachers today need to know about. It's an international concept. It impacts everything. It impacts curriculum. It impacts method of teaching. It even impacts the kinds of things we teach to students. So it's everywhere. So I want to give a practical guide for this. Now, a little bit about myself. My name is Roger Fusselman. I'm from the USA. I've been in Korea for over 20 years as a teacher. I have a TESOL background. I have a master's in TESOL. I've taught at certain universities that have done teacher training. I've done teacher training at Seoul National University of Education, and I've also taught at Sungyeong Women's University. I currently teach at another university, Jungbu University, somewhere in Goyang. And I'm a fun guy. I do comedy sometimes and do a little bit of writing, things like that. So that's who I am. And keep coming in, keep saying who you are as we continue with this topic. So, a lot of what you do as teachers is have to understand the difference between something concrete and something abstract. And we normally call that the difference between theory and practice. Sometimes we have all kinds of theories in our head, but we don't know how to take those ideas and implement them. And so that's very common, and that's one of the things I want to break down for you today. Let's make things a little more concrete from the ideas that move us. So what is this 21st century classroom? Well, one part, the 21st century classroom is student-centered. Now, what's that different from? That's different from teacher-centered, right? And so what does that mean? Well, let's look at a few classrooms or a few ideas. When we think about a teacher-centered approach versus a student-centered approach, we see a shift going on in how we do instruction. So the teacher-centered approach tends to be very much direct instruction. Here the teacher is a formal authority, often in front of the class, telling people, revealing to people what the nature of the subject is. The teacher-centered approach often leans on the teacher as a subject expert. If you're teaching English and you know English grammar, then it means leaning on the teacher as a source for grammatical information. Also, the teacher is a model in this old-fashioned approach. The teacher provides an example of how to act and how to behave with what the goals are. Now, the teacher-centered approach isn't necessarily wrong, but it's one that's going to require a little bit of playing with and shifting with. And nowadays, that's called the student-centered approach. What's that? Well, that kind of learning isn't so much I give it to you, but you go get the learning. So it tends to be very inquiry-based as a learning experience. There tends to be an atmosphere of cooperative learning. Often people are in groups or other things like that. So in that sense, the teacher isn't someone who just gives information. The teacher is a facilitator. Now, what's a facilitator? Think of a conductor in a symphony. The conductor doesn't play any music. So the teacher is kind of conducting the students to go a certain way in the classroom. Also, because of that, the teacher has to delegate. That means give authority to certain other people. Sometimes there will be class captains or group captains or things like that that might be in charge of that particular classroom. So that shift is important. And we also notice that here the teacher is a facilitator of learning. Here, the teacher might create interesting, manageable tasks or sometimes projects that build skills. So part of your job is to make something that they have to do in order to produce what they need to learn. The teacher also, as a facilitator, provides a safe and supportive environment and necessary tools. So that might mean the pencils, the pens, the erasers, whatever markers you need, knowing about the air conditioner, how well it works. That could be a bunch of different things, and that's part of setting the right environment, right? A teacher as a facilitator of learning also gives the right kind of level of support at the right time. You don't want to be too much too fast. You don't want to be not enough. You want to monitor, see what goes on in the classroom, and try to understand from the students in the moment how much they need, where they need it, etc. A lot of your job is looking. And of course, the teacher should provide guidance and constructive feedback. You're not there just to watch them and see what they do. They still need you as a kind of expert, right? So you have to say, well, why don't you try writing this way, that way, or the other way, etc. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the teacher as facilitator of learning. So the 21st century classroom, because of this shift, has to be flexible. You have to be able to move around and deal with things a certain way. So let's look at here's the traditional classroom layout. Now, I want you to notice a few things. Notice that the desks are in rows, that the students are looking at the teacher is in the front, the teacher is almost a little elevated. Here in Korea, sometimes there are little stages that the teacher can teach from. Students are basically looking one way. It's almost like the teacher is on the stage performing a soliloquy from Hamlet or Shakespeare or something like that. Now, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you 1 minute. I want you to type into the comments how the modern classroom looks and how it's different. Think about I'm going to give you 1 minute to think. Now, as I'm talking, I want you to start typing now. Okay, so think about how the desks will be arranged. How would they be different in this particular environment? Keep writing. What would the students be doing? How are the students' relationships in the classroom? Now look at the picture of a traditional classroom. That's a very specific relationship, right? Okay, also look at maybe the technology that you might have in a modern classroom or 21st century classroom. Or think about any other things, the tasks. So I'm going to give you maybe 45 more seconds, maybe a little bit longer. I just want you to write some of your comments. Now, as we're looking at this, you'll notice a few things. You'll still notice that there's a lot of formality to this environment. How is the modern classroom different? You'll notice that there are other things going on in this particular environment involving the teachers and what they do, and the students and what they do. Okay, so as comments come in, I want us to see what we can do. Maybe you'll come up with a few other things. You're going to see the picture, and when you see the picture, you can still add other ideas as you go along. Okay, so here's the picture. Here's what a 21st century classroom layout looks like. Now, again, think and type whatever you want to type. You'll notice a few things. First of all, how are the desks arranged? They are arranged in kind of a box or a circle or something like that. You'll notice also the teacher is a little bit more moving around. Notice in the front of the classroom, there's a screen. Now, and the teacher's kind of in the back. Somehow the students are not really at the end of the learning. They're kind of in the middle of the learning, right? And there's a little bit more inquiry. Now, a lot of classrooms will not look like this in the 21st century. They might be a little bit more comfortable here and there. But you get the idea that these particular classrooms involve a little bit more flexibility in the design and administration of what learning you're doing. So the 21st century classroom teaches skills. What are those skills? Well, let's look at those. There was, in 2002, an important coalition of businesses, educators, policymakers, and they figured out this particular structure. And you'll notice it involves different aspects of what is involved in teaching today. Life and career skills, learning and innovation skills. The orange things are what we're going to focus on today. Information, media, and technology skills, and the key subjects, the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, or mathematics, and 21st century themes. And all that rests on standards, curriculum instruction, professional development that people teach, people learn how to teach, and learning environments. Okay, so this environment is a lot more holistic. Now, what I recommend is remember this particular website, www.p21.org. It does give you more information. Again, p21.org. Very cute. So, what we're focused on today in that whole structure are those 4 C's: critical thinking, collaboration, communication, and creativity. Creativity is in the center. And that's going to be important to integrate these different kinds of things. So let's look at it. The first thing I want to go into, and we'll go in this to a lot of time, is critical thinking. Now in critical thinking, you have to do various things. You have to reason effectively in what you're talking about, make judgments and decisions, and solve problems. Think about what we are as human beings. As human beings, we have to use our minds in order to survive. We're not that strong, right? We don't have claws, we don't have fangs, we're not Hulks, we don't have wings, all kinds of things we don't have. We have to use our minds to survive. So critical thinking is central to life. It's almost the #1 indispensable thing about life. How is a caveman going to make tools? How's a modern person going to live in civilization? So wherever we go, whatever we do, we need the mind in some capacity. So it's important for your students and for you to know about this. So one kind of critical thinking or structure of thinking is what we call deductive reasoning. So think, for example, of a theory, a basic idea, and then an observation of something somewhere out there. So, and then you might come up with a hypothesis. That means a kind of guess, educated guess, on what do you think is true. And you get confirmation. Now let's go through a simple example of this. One thing that was said about people, all men are mortal. That's a theory, right? All human beings die. And then we look at different people. We see somebody like Socrates as a philosopher. And we notice he's a human being, and we think, well, Socrates is mortal, so we come up with this hypothesis. You know, he's going to die too, right? So, and then eventually we confirm that, and he does pass away, unfortunately. So that process goes way back, 2,500 years in history. And so think about it with just a simple example today. You know that all women who are married, or at least almost all women, are going to have a wedding ring on a particular finger. So you'll be walking around and you'll see somewhere in the real world that someone is wearing a ring. So you might think from that, oh, that means that she's married too. Very simple process for this, right? Okay, and the complementary approach is something called inductive reasoning. And that is going to require observing the real world and seeing what's going on. So when you observe, you'll notice this, 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 and this. And then you get a pattern, some sort of connection between all these particular things. And that pattern might leap out at you. It might be hard to find, but it's there. And then you'll come up with a guess based on that pattern. And you'll come up with a conclusion. So you'll notice certain things. So a particular example is you'll notice that a particular bird is white and has a certain kind of beak. And then you'll notice from other birds like this that this bird and that bird and that bird have similar traits. Now maybe later on you'll step back and go, okay, white, beak, certain facial markings, feet, certain kind of feathers, etc. And then you go, okay, all of these birds, all of these swans are white. And you might come up with that hypothesis. And you might confirm it, only later on you'll realize, wait a minute, sometimes there's a black swan. What's going on there? And you might realize, okay, maybe I need to revise the theory, maybe I need to explain more what swans are, maybe there's something underneath that's a little bit more formal and fundamental. Okay, so that process is done casually, even without us knowing about its details. Children will go through this process, adults will go through these processes, etc. Which brings us to abductive reasoning. Sometimes it's a little hard to explain that black swan. And so in this situation, you might have incomplete information. You don't have all that you need. You just have enough, and you realize, so there's a few theories going around that could possibly explain it. And then you might choose from those theories, from the incomplete hypothesis, and give the best possible hypothesis. And then you'll confirm it. You'll see if it's true or not in some way. So think about that. You'll notice that a child sneezes somewhere, some way. and catches what she sneezes in a handkerchief. Now, what does that mean? What kind of illness might she have? Well, she might have a simple cold. She might have something more serious. So you might think about those particular ideas about which of those are, and you'll come to a conclusion based on what you think is the most appropriate. Often diagnosis in science is this method. It's a fun thing to play with kids. Okay, there's also what we call analogical reasoning, and this involves metaphor. Very strong sort of metaphor. So you might have known theories about X, about something, and then you might see Y, another kind of thing. And you'll observe similarities. You'll say this thing and that thing, or this group of things and that group of things have similar attributes. And then you might hypothesize similarities, similar connections. And from that, you're going to confirm what's going on. Okay, so you might notice certain similarities between grizzlies, polar bears, black bears, and something called a panda. And you might come up with hypotheses based on these similarities. Now, pandas aren't officially bears, but there's certain clear similarities. And those are worth going into, those are worth investigating, because you might learn things later on about pandas from your knowledge of bears that do apply. Now, what are those? I'm not sure. But that's just an example. Okay, so let's summarize that. We have deductive reasoning, we have inductive reasoning, we have abductive reasoning, analogical. Remember, deductive goes from general rule to specifics. Inductive goes from specifics to finding a general rule or pattern. Abductive is making a best guess based on incomplete information. And analogical reasoning, we go to accepted similarities between two, and we guess that there are other similarities between those groups. So those are important things to remember when you come up with activities or do things with your students. Another thing to consider in reasoning is logic, fallacies. For example, an ad hominem fallacy. This is what medievals called it. I don't agree with that because the person who said it is a bad person. That's not a rational way to argue. There's a lack of logic there. False causality. Ugh, it always rains when I don't have my umbrella. No, the rain probably caused the umbrella the other way. You can look up informal fallacies, and with certain kinds of students, you can even play with these. You can have them make fallacies. You could have them write a character who has these fallacies. There's all kinds of interesting things you can play with this particular subject. It's a fun one. So we're going to need critical thinking in these areas to make judgments and decisions. So reasoning effectively does apply to these areas. In a world where we're flooded with so much information, what are we going to do? We have to separate the good information from the bad. And one thing to look at is making judgments and decisions based on a simple process. So for example, we need to evaluate evidence, arguments, claims, and beliefs for their validity. Now, how can we do that? Well, there's certain ways to do it. Hello to, let me pause and say hello to people. Hello to Sonia. Hi, Sonia. Hello to Lara, she said before. Cool. Just in a curious mood to say hello to people. Cute. Okay, let's get back to making judgments and decisions. Okay, so there are three important words you can use in order to indicate the process of making judgments and decisions. And try to think in your own mind how you can structure this in the classroom. You might be given information and you go, huh? And that huh asks the question, is it understandable, the information you were given? Is the information confusing or vague? Vague means can't really tell what it is. So that it might be your initial reaction to certain information. And then it moves to really? And really you start to ask more higher level questions. So is that information I got factually true? You know, does it Does it correspond to the real world in some way? Is it logical? Does it make sense? Is it connected? Or does it not fit with my other information? Maybe this is true, but my other information is not true. Maybe the other information is true and this isn't true. Something like that. The evidence, why should I believe this? Okay, so let's say you go, huh, and then you go up to really, now you go to so. So, here you might get in more evaluative aspects of connecting that information with other data. So why does that matter? Why is that important, this particular information? Who is it important to? And how much? Now imagine a decision-making process here. So you might, let's say you're trying to hire someone for a new job. You might look at the information that they might send with a resume. It might be clear, might not be clear, and they might check the resume, and that's your really process where you're checking it for logic and other things, resume or CV, curriculum vitae. And then so you might ask questions about that possible person. Could that person work in this job? Is that person reliable? How helpful will it be to work with that person, etc.? And then based on the resume, you'll make a decision. Should I hire that person or not? So we all go through this process, but it can be simplified and understood a little bit more clearly. So a third thing to look at is solving problems. This is what life is about, and this is kind of the fun of life, really. And there is a process for solving problems. And you can think of it as DIEI. Define the problem. Is there a problem? What is it exactly? Is it important? What is causing it? Who is causing it? Any kind of information like that can tell us more about how to deal with it. Ideate. This is a fancy word for coming up with ideas. What are some different things we could do to solve the problem? Now, you're not making a decision yet about which idea to choose. That comes later. First, when we come up with ideas, we don't care that much about quality. We care about getting ideas out of our head onto a piece of paper or something like that. So the third stage is to look at those ideas and evaluate them. Which is the best option to solve the problem? And any other methods that we might want to consider. And then after we've gone through the D and the I and the E, now it's time to implement or think about implementing this problem. How do we put the idea? How do we put the idea in action? So how can we do it? Does it solve the problem? Is there anything else needed in order to figure it out? Okay, so let's move on to the topic of collaboration. This is working together with people, right? Okay, so we can break down collaboration into working with others to achieve a goal. So everyone is on the same page of what they need to do. Be flexible and open with people as the process. We can't just be closed and with our brow furrowed and say, well, my way or the highway. Nope, got to be open when you collaborate. Sharing group responsibilities so that one person doesn't do everything and other people don't do a thing at all. And value contributions from each member. It's amazing what you can get when you value contributions even from the newest, most green, most rookie-like people in the group. Amazing things can happen that way. So here's what I want you to think about. Why do some teachers avoid student group work? Think about your own particular answers to this. So look at the picture. This is kind of a horror show, potential horror show for what happens in the process of collaboration, right? Certain things like this can happen. And I mean not this particular scenario, but those sorts of things. And feel free, by the way, to type any kind of ideas or theories or reactions to your own thoughts about this. Try to share, on occasion, in the chat room, your own ideas. And then I can share more publicly through my own voice and my own interpretation of those ideas. So why do some teachers avoid student group work? Good question. And we can think of it this way. These are some ideas, but you probably know a few others, so feel free to type any of your own. So if a group is not managed well, you can have issues with group work. A group can be difficult to control. Things can get out of hand. It's important to have a goal, otherwise it might become a little bit chaotic. It might become a little bit noisy. That can be an issue. Sometimes activities require everyone to be noisy at the same time. So how would you structure that in order that the noise is reduced? The teachers next door or people in the hallway might have a different reaction to your activity than you do. Students could get off task easily during group things. They might wander and talk about other ideas, share other things about their lives or about the activities that don't matter at all. Also, as a teacher, a lot of what you do involves assessment and figuring out where particular students are. Sometimes group work can be difficult to assess. So if collaboration is something that you're assessing officially or unofficially, it's good for your students to know what you consider great collaboration, medium collaboration, or poor collaboration. Okay? And that brings us to more particular ways of solving these problems. So one way is to keep groups small, 4 or fewer. Nowadays, I've been teaching a lot on Zoom, and everyone can kind of guess why I'd be using Zoom to teach, right? And I try to keep groups to 4, but sometimes I can't. Sometimes it's time for a pair, and a pair on Zoom to get together and share their own ideas. So it doesn't always work that way. There are reasons for larger groups in the moment and what you have to consider, but at least for initial thinking, a little talking, 4 or few is better. You want to have clearly defined objectives, a clearly defined procedure, assessment criteria at the beginning, and some way to check. So what are they going to do? What should they make? Or what should they produce? What are you going to look at? And what matters to you? That could be the language you have in mind, particular goal you have in mind for what they're producing, and assigning roles for each student. So I worked with a teacher. She gave out little cards that said, okay, you're the record keeper, you're the presenter, you're the chairperson, you're the idea person, you criticize, etc. So you could have those on little index cards. Choosing tasks that offer suitable challenge and complexity. If it's group work, but it's kind of boring, it's a little harder for the group to get into. And offer scaffolding for weird students. Now, get out a pen, go to your screen, and underline on your screen the word scaffolding. That's a very important teacher word. Because what does that mean? Well, a scaffold is a thing that surrounds a building in order for you to put it up. So, for example, in China, they use bamboo, right? And there's a big bamboo thing that they put up. And then when they have the scaffold up, then they raise the building. And the scaffold is what a teacher does, right? The teacher helps the child to grow academically. Okay, now once the child has grown academically for this building, the scaffold can be removed. So you don't keep the scaffolding up forever. And think of the buildings that are constructed. You don't see the scaffolds around them when they're finished. So a lot of your job is to make you unnecessary at the end of the process, that the student can be independent and going on, just as a scaffold would for a building. So that's a beautiful metaphor. That brings us to the topic of communication. Now, in communication, what do? Well, communication is sharing ideas with others. So it's important to articulate thoughts effectively, knowing how to get your thought clear to someone else. Communication is a two-way street, so you have to listen to others to make sure that they know what to do. Communication often involves a variety of aims and audiences. Last night I was listening to a 90-minute lecture on public speaking. And this particular public speaker suggested that you should not write out your speech. You should not even use a PowerPoint. What he suggested was that you should take heavy notes about what you care about, then simplify those notes, because for different audiences, you have to change the message. And that's what makes speaking interesting to him, exciting for him, enjoyable for him, and necessary for the process of communication. So you never step into the same audience twice. Not really. You have to change things from time to time depending on what you see in them. And the same is even more true for a teacher and more true for the kind of communication that you want to teach your students. There's also media and technology involved in today's speaking. We're not Roman senators from 2,000 years ago. There's a lot more technological stuff we have to deal with. That brings us to ways of communication. So here's one system. It's called the CI. So S stands for state, in my opinion. E stands for elaborate. Elaborate means go on, develop more work on something. Exemplify means give examples, for example, and illustrate. It's like, and here, there's a little bit of analogical reasoning. There's a little bit of integration to other things. This is a really good process, not just for communication, but also for thinking. So flag this in your head as also critical thinking too. CI. Let's look at the paragraph. Learning is a process of gaining knowledge, understanding, and ability. Okay, that gives the official opinion, the official idea. In other words, learning is a process by which a person gains specific knowledge, understands knowledge, and specific skill and ability. Often learning involves gaining all three. True learning involves internalization, knowledge being learned. That's definitely elaboration, right? For example, a child slowly learns to ride a bike by being guided, by practicing, and occasionally by falling down. Nice. That is a very good way of making it more concrete. Notice at the end of the paragraph, learning is like eating. What we eat becomes part of us. That's a good ending. You are what you eat. So you notice that kind of paragraph, that kind of structure really communicates the thought. In part because you've thought through the thought. You haven't just communicated it. You thought of how the ideas relate to the concrete world. Okay, so active listening. Here you have to pay attention and connect, look interested, nod, etc. You have to reflect on feelings. You sound upset, pleased. Oh, you seem anxious about something. That's when you're listening to somebody. Oh, okay, it sounds like you think this. Now, also notice that you have to paraphrase what people say. So what you're saying is, that's part of what I learned about listening, that you hear what they say so that you can summarize what they said back to them. If you can't do that, you didn't really listen. You heard, but you didn't listen. There's a difference. So you mean, can I just check you said? These are very important. And summarizing. So overall, it seems, so we decided that kind of process makes listening a lot more active and shows that you're listening and tests your own self that you listen to the other person. So you also want to maximize chances for output. So what does that mean? That means speaking, writing, putting different skills together, a combination of speaking and writing. That might mean a diverse amount of formats, genres, digital, traditional, doesn't matter. It can be old-fashioned, etc. So communication, there's different aspects to speaking. Sometimes you're interactive, sometimes you're productive. Interactive goes back and forth. Productive kind of goes one way, for the most part. So when you're interactive, it's more conversational, it's more goal-oriented with cooperation. An interview is a good example of that. But when you're productive, you're describing an experience, you might be giving instructions, public pronouncement or broadcast. This, in many ways, is a productive process. Okay, so the teacher-student interaction model. Normally we think of that as the teacher initiates, the student responds, and the teacher gives feedback. But look at the picture. This is a little bit more modern. That old-fashioned way is a little too structured and the teacher's always in control. You don't want to hold on to the dog too tightly, so to speak. You want to give even animals a little bit more room, and human beings 100 times more so, right? So there are other methods that you can use. Follow-up questions, casual conversation. What are you doing, Billy? Oh, that's interesting. So what's that picture you're making? So that makes the students collaborate almost with the teacher. And that's a very important aspect of learning. So you can see here different kinds of things that students can do. Presentations, showing off your solar system. The one-on-one interview. Group discussion. Pair work, teamwork, role play, formal date. And look at the picture for role play. It's so cute. It's so cute. They're at a hospital. Isn't that adorable? And formal debate, where different sides have to fight each other. That can be, all these can be fun. I've done all these. These are all great things to do. And I recommend screenshotting that, maybe not on your computer, but in your head. And so, aspects of communication. Writing is a variety of genres and purposes, emotional expression, real communication, not copying, reading passages, not to model the writing, but to spark the ideas. Sometimes they're reading something just to get their ideas going, not necessarily to study the writing. So not all writing that is involved, that they do, will be for models. Sometimes they're just writing a little bit to get things started. And also in writing, there's interaction and there's production. Instruction manuals are more productive. Interactive, correspondence, writing letters, notes, passing little notes to each other, messages, etc. Okay, so in the modern world, we want to do a little bit more communication, and it'd be helpful in your class if you brought in tasks that involve social media, commenting, video blogging, forums for their talking, any blogging that they can do. On some modern LMSs, there are discussion boards. So a lot of these are possible, probably in some of the institutions where you're at. You need opportunities for interaction with native speakers. And nowadays, that's much easier. Let's say you're not teaching English. If you're teaching another language that has very few native speakers, with technology, you can bring that person in from Skype or Zoom or whatever it is, whatever technology you're comfortable with, so they can be exposed to it. So that person on the other side of the world, that person can come to your classroom virtually. Now, creativity is the final one I want to talk about. And when we're creative, we want to think creatively, we want to work creatively with others, and we want to implement innovations. So it's important to keep in mind that a creative person and a creative classroom does not involve complete, total freedom. It's freedom within structure, like they teach in Montessori schools. Complete freedom is overwhelming. Because they'll just do anything. So you want to set aims and boundaries within the structure of what you want to achieve. So creativity involves putting on different hats. So at one point, the person might be a dreamer. The dreamer comes up with ideas and doesn't care really about logic or other things too much. So the dreamer is, how about doing this? Why don't we do this? Ooh, this is a good idea. Let's try that. So there's not holding back. Now the realist steps in and looks at those ideas and go, okay, how could we make this a little more practical? Or how can we make things happen with this idea? And the critic might go, wait a minute, and evaluate some of these ideas and redefine ideas. So a lot of creativity is knowing which voice to use at certain times. So it means being a little bit multiple personality, you could say, but in a healthy, positive, and creative way. So keep in mind how ideas become creative. You might absorb ideas and connect them the first time, and then you'll manage these ideas in a certain way, and that idea will connect with another idea, and those new ideas will come up from those old ideas. And so over time you build a web, you build an interactive web of what's going on. Think of a child, a curious child going through this process. It's almost like bacteria, where an idea grows and splits into derivative ideas and keeps growing and growing and growing. And that's the process we want to encourage. So there's a million ways of doing this, a million ways of communicating creatively. And you'll notice a few here. Look in the bottom left-hand corner, 6 thinking hats. That's from Edward de Bono. Edward de Bono, I think, is Australian, and he's the founder of what we call lateral thinking. And a lot of what his own thinking was, thinking isn't just straightforward. It's sometimes going off into little differences here and there. It's not just one line pointed in one direction. And so he has a whole book called 6 Thinking Hats, where he mentions that the white hat person has to analyze, the green hat person has to generate ideas, the black hat has to critically evaluate, the blue hat might have to facilitate, go behind different ideas. The red hat, emotions. Emotions are very powerful for the creative process. If you're emotionally repressed, that's going to get in the way of your creativity. So you want excited, sometimes even immature, a little arrogance sometimes in your classroom because of that. And assessment, positive assessment, that's different from critical assessment. It's important to see the good ideas. Sometimes it's more important to notice the good ideas than to counteract the bad ideas. So we have other terms, and I just want you to think of these terms. Concept triangle, scamper, there's your lateral thinking, provocation and movement. 6 value metals, star bursting, the don't sell me game, brainstorming. So all these kinds of words, let them just bubble in the back of your mind, because you can search for any of these. So here's a classic example of this particular thing, mind mapping. And I've heard different schools as to how valid and how effective mind mapping is. But it's one of many particular creativity tools. So in your mind mapping, in this case, you have the central idea in the middle, and major importance, benefits of mind mapping, collaboration of mind mapping, productivity of mind mapping, the creativity of mind mapping. Okay, and you'll notice it goes off into other ideas that are sort of minor ideas compared to the bigger ideas. So the benefits, easy to memorize, simple, fast, and fun. Notice sometimes a mind map can be used to prepare students for a presentation. So you notice where it says benefits, overview, that indicates something that the student wants to present, or the student is about to present. Look at planning, mind mapping planning, planning goals, planning strategies. So you can help plan goals and strategies, and also projects. Now you'll see a yellow line connecting overview and projects. Mind mappings can be messy, disgusting things. Thinking is a messy, disgusting business, and it's wonderful. And mind maps are very important to that. Now you could clean it up later, but we need to get things together. Think of a sculptor who gets his hands dirty after sculpting. He might wash his hands at the end, but creativity can be a messy process, and that's fine, as long as you clean up at the end of the day. Collaboration, examples. Productivity, examples. Creativity, examples. So this is a process that you can consider. I want you to think about these kinds of things as we talk about a particular series of books. And that's the Big Show series, and this is offered by Compass Publishing. Thank you very much, Compass. And this particular series does aim at a lower level of student, a younger level of student, and does involve more scaffolding than some of the other series that are involved. So it goes through 6 different levels. Book 1 is pre-A1, that's A1 on the CEFR, so the European framework on language levels. It's a starter. It's basically a starter, and it provides a lot of phonics. Phonics is very important in this world these days, particularly when you get more and more learners of English that come from language backgrounds that do not use the Roman alphabet. Book 2, CEFR level, pre-A1, A1, starter mover with phonics. Book 3, CEFR, A1, young learner, etc. And you'll see from here that it moves up these different levels. It goes to A1 and A2. And that's very important for the lower levels to make sure that they're more honed, they're ready, and they're more confident when they move to something more challenging. And it's got a beautiful title, Big Show. Already I like it. Okay, so what's the concept? Well, it's built on the CEFR-based curriculum. It takes students gradually from producing simple phrases to complex sentences. So we're starting small with like Lego, and we're building to bigger Lego things. You could think of it that way. It includes conversation, songs, comics, content learning in language, or contact language and learning. I still get those confused. So there's stories for that. So you can learn content while learning language at the same time. Activities developed to improve learning, reading, writing, listening, and speaking skills. So it's not just like a book, there's like a fleet of things going on. So there's song animations, there's videos, there's additional readers, provide opportunities for digital literacy in the 21st century skills. That's very important. I've seen 5-year-old children that are using tablet PCs. They're playing on tablet PCs. They're 5 years old. I didn't have that when I was 5 years old. So technology starts very young. And it's important that we keep up with that and that we maintain that. And that's one of the things that Big Show does. So if you look at the chart, you'll notice this chart compares Big Show with other fine Compass products. And you'll notice it goes from PK to grade 6. G1, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, 4, grade 5, grade 6. That H1, think of that as middle school, high school, that area. And the other books are a little scaffolded more for the higher levels than the lower ones. But it's very important to address the lower ones because that's really your gateway to the confidence that you'll build in your child. Okay, so looking at book 1, how is that organized? Well, focus your eyes on this. And I'm going to do this too. You'll notice there's 12 regular units with the intro and 3 review units in each book. So that's 15 units total, right? There's going to be 6 target words for set 1, and there's going to be another set that goes on, and that other set is going to be 4 words. So there's going to be a target sentence. So you're not just getting a page of vocabulary and a page of grammar separate like that. They're kind of mixed together because that's how they're going to be experiencing language anyway. They get language in a mixture, what we call a random salad in the US, or a jjampong in Korea. So that mixture is important to not just negate, but to kind of accept and deal with. So that target sentence pattern is there. And notice, next page, there are comic books, there are comics that engage the students they can look at. They can even draw. Have your kids vandalize these textbooks. Have them write and draw things there. They should feel that open, engaged, unless you can. So you'll also see that they can scan a QR code. Now, why do that? Well, they can view the karaoke version of the song animation, and there are even videos in books 5 and 6. So keep that in mind, that there are places to go beyond there. This page is an adventure that can take them outside of the page. That brings us to book 2. And book 2, you notice again, 4 target words. You'll see that those words are kind of light. They could probably trace over the letters to internalize the feel of those words. Again, there's a target sentence pattern. There's one review of target sentence pattern 2. And that's going to be part of the process. And you'll see a little cartoon there to visualize and engage. They might trace the letters and match them with the words. And the pictures will be slightly different, not the same picture. That's too easy. And notice the phonics is going to be in books 1 through 4. So we have apple, ant, ball, bear, etc. And a sentence that helps them do that. And it's fun to practice those sentences, particularly if they can use something physical. The ant has an apple. When I first came to Korea, the Macarena was big. So I still think everyone knows the Macarena, but if you don't, no. Okay. Okay, so let's move on. That's book 2. It gives you a hint of book 2 and how it's organized. Book 3 is starting to get a little bit more serious. Now you notice here, it's a little bit of a reader, right? Content, language in learning and it's a social studies thing. So this content, language, and learning reading is related to a unit topic or a sentence pattern. So you get a little more meat going on now here, and it's a little bit more visual, a little bit more like what we could say a story or a flood of input. Now, what does that mean? Well, you still have to negotiate other things like read and circle the item and what do we eat. You have to respond to sentences a little bit more. And again, scan the QR code to view the free reader's animation, okay, because that's going to be part of the process. Now, book 4. That brings us up a little bit higher in what we're doing. And notice units 1 to 4, this looks like a review page. Remember, a review is provided every 4 units. So you'll notice here that there's kind of a game involved. It's a kind of a start to finish board game kind of thing. One thing you can do with that is you can even change the board game. They can draw little pictures and put it on there. A textbook is interesting. You don't necessarily have to use the textbook the way that the makers used it. So if you find yourself having ideas for pages that the textbook did not, great. So that's the thing that leaps out at to me about this, that they can change the pictures somehow. They could keep the pictures. They could make their own, you know? So that could change the design of the game, the kinds of things you focus on for the game, all kinds of possibilities. So moving on, book 5. Now here you'll notice a little bit more language going through the process and a little bit more of a linguistic challenge. You'll see a kind of a grid with all these letters in order to find the word and identify the picture that goes with the word. You notice the words are not put next to the picture. So maybe you have to remember how the words were spelled before. And again, more comics. And now you also see a little bit of workbookishness in this kind of thing. There's a workbook and there's a student book, and that's an important thing to consider when getting a series. Now I want to talk a little bit about the supplemental material. In fact, no, I want to talk a lot about the supplemental material. So what are some things you'll get? Well, let's go through these. Think of you get a free MP3 that's connected to that. There's answer key, of course, so you can see what's going on. Classroom PowerPoints. I'll show you those. So if you're wondering what those look like, don't worry, they're coming. Word lists, word tests. There are ways of using word lists in the classroom that are not just study the list. There are random things you can do with those word lists. You could have them do games where they slap the word, where they have to categorize the words. Those kinds of things can be done with word lists. Word test, dictation sheets. So there's a sheet where they have to dictate what they hear. Dictation is a good old-fashioned activity that is still with us today and has uses for other things. There's even something called dictogloss. Sometimes it's called grammar dictation, where you learn grammar by listening to the same passage 2 times and then dictating from there. The first time you don't listen, the first time you don't dictate, you just listen. The second time you dictate, and don't worry in the dictation if you don't finish things, because you can work with the other student to kind of guess what was there and use your own memory and co-construct. Translation sheet, unscramble sheet, unit test, review test, mid-test, final test. That might simplify things if you're a busy teacher, right? Placement tests. What class are the students going to go into? Where are they going to go? Flashcards. That's going to be necessary to engage younger kids. And flashcards can be used different ways. You can put them on the floor. You could line up flashcards on the floor, have one student here, and they have to say the word, and when they say the word, they can move to the next one, move to the next one, move to the next one, and kind of do a racing game. And let's say they meet here, they can rock, paper, scissors, and whoever loses has to go to the back of the line. So you can do flashcard races with the words in the textbook on the floor with kids moving around in the class. Syllabus. lesson plan, translations. Again, that's to make things easier for you and for the other things you have to consider. Because you have monitoring to do, you might have come up with your own creative ideas. You might want to engage with your students more. This is to alleviate the burden for you to do other things. So the tests, speaking very quickly, writing and listening test, vocabulary test, sentence completion, and phonics test. And that's going to be important. Classroom PowerPoint. We have song animations in the classroom PowerPoint. We have videos in the classroom PowerPoint and extra reading materials. And those can be accessed offline if you want them. There are other class booster things, song animation, videos, and extra forms of practice. Keep those in mind. Now I want you to absorb this page. Now imagine you're in the classroom and you have this as your PowerPoint. Is it a cake? Notice how big the letters are, how they communicate. These PowerPoints are already available. And you have clear pictures, you can interact. Imagine yourself standing up there and students coming up to the screen perhaps to do some kind of activity or to point at words as you read along. It continues with other things. So it goes through the books very, very step by step. In the old days, you had to put the PowerPoint on the screen and kind of walk through this PowerPoint from the screen. And here, it's a little bit more simplified, a little bit clearer. It's not exactly the same as a book, so they kind of have to translate between the book and there in a way that facilitates learning, does not get in the way of learning. There's matching. There's all kinds of things. As long as you have these, then you can make a maximum impact with your lesson as you go along. Okay, so I want to ask you, are there any questions? Give yourself a minute if you want to ask any questions. Because these questions might be helpful and I can answer those. Now, while you're thinking of questions to ask, and no worries if you don't, I want to review what we've done already. We've talked about the 4 C's: collaboration, critical thinking, creativity, and communication. We've talked about concrete ways to take these ideas and implement them in the classroom, to develop creativity, for example, to do communication, speaking, and writing, to expand on their knowledge of how to reason effectively, how to solve problems, and how to deal with the world in a rational way. And we've also talked a little bit about the process of them working together with others, of having them be independent people in a somewhat interdependent world. So we've walked through those 4 C's. We've explained at the beginning what those 4 C's were about, and we also talked about one series, Big Show, that we think is effective for these and other processes to consider. And that's what we've done today. It seems like I've done very well in the presentation because I didn't hear any questions. But don't worry, stay in touch with Compass and with other people related to Compass as you learn more about this and other things. So I want to thank everybody, and I want to say thank you for listening, thank you for engaging with me, hearing what I have to say, hearing these ideas, and especially thinking about these ideas. I want you to go out in the world and do those particular ideas. And I also want you to do one more thing. Stay here, because John Edwards is going to talk about writing as part of Compass Day 6. And with that, I want to say thank you for listening to me. My name is Roger Fusselman. I hope all the best for you, and I hope to see you again. So I'm going to go like this, although I don't usually do that, except in the age of Zoom, and say thank you for everything. That's all.
Compass Publishing.
Hi everybody, welcome back for another Compass seminar. This time I'm coming to you, we're going to be talking about writing, teaching writing to all levels. I hope you enjoyed Roger's seminar, and I hope you get something out of this seminar as well. As usual, I'll be watching the comment section for any of your questions, and I'll try to address them as we go. If not, if you want to ask me a question at the end of the presentation, I'll be spending about 5 minutes taking your questions as well. So it's up to you how you want to do that. And anyway, I hope you learned something today and have something that you can apply to your classes and improve your students' writing. So let's begin. So my presentation is called Teaching Writing, Getting Your Students to Enjoy Writing in English. A lot of students don't like writing, and a lot of teachers avoid writing, so I wanted to go through some theory and some methods that you can use to get your students writing and enjoying writing, and to feel more comfortable as a teacher as well. So the plan is, we'll talk about some problems that teachers have with teaching writing, some common methods that teachers use, methods in quotes, a little bit about choosing writing tasks, the kinds of tasks that we need to choose for our students. We'll talk about product, process, and the genre. Those are 3 different approaches to teaching writing. Then we'll go through the writing process, which is the approach that I advocate, the process approach. We'll talk about pre-writing, drafting, revising, editing, and publishing. And then we'll end up talking about the writing framework, which is a new series that Compass Publishing is coming out with in the next couple of months. So let's start by talking about some common methods that teachers use to teach writing. The first one is called the Laissez-Faire Method. Laissez-faire just means leave it alone in French. So a lot of teachers, they kind of ignore writing. They think it'll develop on its own. They think other skills are more important, and they don't focus on writing in the classroom. So this means that a lot of students don't develop those skills, and they end up, after many years of English instruction, they end up being unable to write. So that kind of limits their ability to go into certain majors where they have to write essays, for example, and it definitely limits their career prospects in the future. Another method that some teachers use is the sink or swim method. This means that they don't actually teach skills, they just assign tasks. They're just assigning a task, leaving it up to the students to figure out how to do the task, and then they collect it and mark it. So this is what we call the sink or swim method. They just throw the students into the water and expect that they will learn on their own how to swim. So this is also not a good method. The reason is that students are inevitably going to find the process of writing very frustrating because they don't know what to do. They don't have the skills, they haven't developed the skills to handle different kinds of tasks. So they're going to learn to hate writing. So this is also not a good method for obvious reasons. So why do some teachers avoid teaching writing? Why do some teachers use these 2 so-called methods? Well, maybe it comes partly from the students' attitudes towards writing. Some students don't like it, or they don't think it's important. They don't think they'll need it in their lives. It's kind of like trigonometry. They think, oh, writing in English, I'll never have to do that. They can't project into the future and see that actually they will need it later. Some teachers may not do a lot of writing themselves, so they may not see it as a valuable skill. They don't write a lot in English, so they don't think their students will need to do that either. They assume. Also, some teachers just don't know how to teach it. Maybe they didn't really spend a lot of time doing it in the past, or they don't have the know-how. They haven't done a lot of research about how to teach it. And a lot of teachers think that writing is a kind of specialized skill that's better taught in other classes, like in test preparation classes or in specialized writing classes. So this is why some teachers avoid teaching writing. But if we think about it, if we do sort of a very rough needs analysis or needs assessment of our students, we can see that it's actually a very necessary skill. They're going to need it for, it's necessary for everyday purposes, like if they're communicating with native speakers, they're going to need it for sending SMS, text messages, sending simple emails, personal emails, filling out forms, these kinds of things, like everyday tasks. If they travel, they'll definitely need to fill out forms, things like this. If they want to rent a car when they go on a trip, for example. If they go to school, if they go to university or high school in an English-speaking environment, they'll definitely need writing skills for note-taking, essay writing, taking exams. And if they want to, these days in business, even small and medium businesses are doing business with, with other countries, and that's usually done in English. So they're going to need to write emails, look at contracts, write proposals, write reports, make presentations, and all of these things require writing skills. So it's obvious that if they are going to be working or studying or traveling in an English-speaking environment, writing is very important. So the big message here is we should teach the skills of writing. We shouldn't just throw tasks at students. We shouldn't ignore writing. But as teachers of English, we should teach those skills. That's very important in any English class. So a little note about choosing writing tasks. So there's a lot of different tasks that we can select from, and they vary according to the focus of the task. So this is actually taken from a book by Jeremy Harmer. He said that it ranges from very accuracy focused, for example, things like copying, doing dictation, all the way up to very fluency focused activities like process writing, free writing, where they're writing exactly what they want to write and they're not given a lot of guidance, and the focus is on speed and expressing yourself in writing very quickly. And between those two extremes, there's sort of semi-controlled activities, so guided writing and controlled writing, where the students are given some freedom, some latitude to express themselves, but there's also some structure to the process. So these are some of the different options that are available. And we would choose those as teachers. We would choose certain ones depending on the level of our students, how familiar they are with writing. For example, for very low-level students, for students that are just starting out with writing, maybe we want to lean more towards the accuracy-focused activities, and we want to slowly expand to fluency-focused. Obviously, fluency development is important, and we should work on that as early as possible, but they can't really start with fluency development until they have at least some foundation in grammar, in structures, in vocabulary. So maybe that's for low intermediate students. We also need to think about, when we're choosing tasks, we also need to think about including a lot of variety. Variety is very critically important to our students. The reason is they need to be exposed to a wide variety of tasks in order to build familiarity with the structures, with the kinds of language that's needed, and the format, the genre. So we need to choose different genres. We need to get them to write for different purposes and for different audiences. And we need to get them to use different kinds of organizational patterns or formats. But we also need to be careful that those should be appropriate for the age and the level of our students. And if we just focus only on the organizations, I've kind of color-coded them along the bottom. So maybe descriptive organizations are the easiest, where we just get the students to write what they see, what things look like, what they see in front of them. This is probably the easiest organization. And narrative is also fairly easy. And process or chronological. The reason is it's not so conceptual. It's very kind of linear structure. But the more complicated ones are things like cause and effect, compare and contrast, problem solution, and argumentative essays. These are getting progressively more complicated, and maybe we should reserve those for higher levels. So the point that I was making before is that we should have lots of variety, and we should choose our tasks according to the level and the age to make them appropriate for the level and the age of our students. But we also have to think about some other things. They should be interesting. They should be things that the students will get interested in writing about, something that's relevant to them and that they have something to say about. It should include some freedom of choice. Students should be able to choose, for example, what's your favorite animal? They should be able to choose the animal that they talk about. We shouldn't give them a task like write about giraffes. The reason is, if we give them freedom of choice, there's more chance of engagement and enjoyment of the task. So that's going to have a positive effect on the learning experience. It should be appropriate for the language level, the age, the cognitive level also. Like, we can't give them tasks to do that are above their cognitive level. They don't have a kind of conceptual framework in which to express their opinion. We should also reflect, as much as possible within the classroom, we should reflect real life purposes, realistic contexts, and kind of authenticity, authentic texts. So I know this is not always possible in the classroom, but we should try. We should try to mimic real life situations. For example, we could say, let's say you're starting a club in your school. You want to start a club, and think of the club, work with a group and think of the club and what you want to do, how often you want to meet, where you're going to meet, these kinds of things. It can be any kind of club you want. But the important thing is, I want you to write an ad to put in the school newspaper to advertise your club. So this could be a realistic, something that students could really have to do in life. So this is what I mean by realistic or authentic. Let's talk a little bit about product, process, and genre, which are three approaches to teaching writing. So they're also kind of historical. So in terms of L1 instruction and also L2 instruction, there's been a progression of different approaches throughout the history of language teaching. So before the mid-1960s, the focus was on the product, the final output. So there wasn't really any instruction about the stages or the kind of the process about how to get there. There was just focus on the final output. And it was, the tasks were very controlled, and it was done sort of usually as a single draft. There weren't multiple drafts done. So this was the approach, the earliest approach for teaching writing. But then about the mid-1960s, there was a shift towards teaching process. So there was this kind of realization that writing is non-linear and generative. There's a generative nature to writing. What does that mean? That means that as we write, we form our ideas, we form our opinions. Like writing, the process of writing it forms our ideas. So in order to kind of reflect that, the focus shifted to more process orientation. So there was lots more group work, and it was much more student-centered, and there were multiple stages in the process. So the writing went through multiple stages. There was a draft, there was a second draft, there was a final draft. More recently, since the early 2000s, there's been a shift to a genre approach, or sometimes it's combined with a process approach and genre approach. What does that mean? It means that writing is a social communication. It's a form of social communication. And when we're writing, we should always be conscious of the people that we're writing to and the socially accepted forms of writing. So there's kind of, there are formats that we should learn and rules for using them. And so knowledge of those genres and knowledge of those forms is necessary, and the teacher has to address those. That there has to be some kind of study of the different genres. So this is the most recent approach. So this is all about teaching the genres and the conventions of writing. So writing is more than just academic forms. We can't only teach essay writing in our classroom. Students need to develop familiarity with a wide variety of different genres. So take a look at this list on the right-hand side of the slide. As soon as you read those expressions, you know what genre it is. For example, once upon a time, you know right away it's a fairy tale. Or BTW, could you please? THX. So right away you know this is a text message. Or first, add. So it's obviously a recipe or some instructions for making something. So these examples just show you that the conventions of language that we use are very familiar to most speakers in a language environment, in a language community. So we have to teach that to our students so they can be familiar too. When they're writing an email, a friendly email, for example, they know the kinds of language that they can use, or especially for things that are more formal, like proposals, like business email. We need to teach those things. So here's an example, just about the structure of a business letter, where we have the addresses and the date in a certain location. We have the salutation that has certain language conventions, like if we don't know the name of the person, we say, to whom it may concern, or dear sir or madame. This is very formal, and in certain situations we don't know the name of the person we're writing to. We would use that kind of salutation. And then we have the body, where we have one main point per paragraph, and the flow of ideas is also dictated to some extent. We usually make a connection with the person, we say what we want, and then we say what the expected behavior is, and the follow-up that we expect. And then we have a closing, like sincerely or yours truly or kind regards, and then we sign it and we put our title at the bottom. So this is a kind of example of the genre of formal business letter. So there's lots of different genres that we could teach. They're from very simple and short genres like recipes, postcards, all the way up to more complex ones like editorials, formal business letters, proposals. So which ones do we focus on? Well, we should look at our course material, and we should think about the needs of our students. So can we kind of anticipate where our students will be in 5 or 10 years and what they will need to be doing? Maybe we should focus on those genres, give them a little bit of experience with those genres. For example, if your students are studying to go abroad, to go to university in another country, maybe you should focus on essay writing, filling out forms, this kind of thing. It should also include the most common and most useful genres, and we should match the age and the level of the students. So for younger students, we should do things like writing emails, postcards, maybe making advertisements and posters. And then as they get older, we should focus more on like essay writing, business letters, things like this, EAP type genres. So the typical kind of learning cycle for a genre approach is this awareness raising activity. So it starts with an awareness raising activity where you bring a model, an example of that genre, and look at it with the students as a whole class. So you read it together and you say, well, what's going on here and what kind of language are they using and what's the structure? So you examine it together collaboratively, maybe you with several examples. Then you go through a joint construction where you have a task. For example, okay, we're going to write to this person and tell them about our trip to Morocco and what we're doing and when we're coming back. So you have some information that you write on the board, and then together you construct that postcard, for example. And then you move on from there to explicit instruction and language practice activities. So this is the typical kind of flow, the learning cycle for a genre approach. Let's shift now to talk about the writing process. So we actually have different ways of writing if we think about our own life and the way that we write. If we have informal or kind of unimportant writing to do, it's usually done without a plan, and we just start at the beginning of the passage and we write to the end, and then we send it to the audience. And there's usually just one draft, and there's not really any revision or correction. And we might edit it, but we edit it sort of on the fly. That means as we go, we edit it. And there's a high tolerance for errors. It doesn't really matter if we make spelling mistakes or grammar mistakes, not so much. So that's one kind of mode of writing. But we have another mode of writing when we have a kind of more formal writing that we have to produce, and it's more high stakes. That means there's some consequences for the writing. If we make some mistakes or if it's not well worded, maybe the person who is reading it will have a negative effect, or they will have a bad opinion of us, for example. So usually for this kind of writing, we go through a brainstorming process. It could be very short, just sketching out some ideas, or it could be more extended. We plan out the writing. We plan out what we're going to write and the sections. Maybe we could even research it and plan out our reasoning, the kinds of evidence that we're going to use, the kinds of argument that we're going to use. We might write multiple drafts and revising at each stage. We might get it reviewed by other people. We might write a draft and get one of our colleagues to look at it, and then get feedback and then do some revision or editing. And for this kind of writing, there's a very low tolerance for errors. Errors are an embarrassment, or they affect the outcome that we expect from the writing. So why should we, the point of that slide was just, we don't always use process writing. Sometimes we don't use it and sometimes we do use it, but we should teach it. So why should we teach process writing? Well, the basic concept here is we want to model this behavior so that students internalize it. We want to model the behavior of writing according to a process so that students are guided through the process. They become familiar with those steps and they internalize them, and that can make them become independent, competent writers, especially for more formal writing, more high-stakes writing. I'll just pause for a second. Wafa says, if students are to come up with a business letter, they should be provided with the requisite do's and don'ts. For example, whether to use sincerely or faithfully depends on the salutation. Yeah, definitely. There are conventions for business letters depending on the relationship that we have. For example, if you don't know the person, you might say something a little more neutral, like yours truly or sincerely. But if you know them a little bit, you might say kind regards or all the best, something a little more friendly and warm. So there's these kinds of conventions. So if we think about the writing process, there's different ways of dividing it up, but I've seen, most commonly, I've seen 5 stages. So there's pre-writing, where we understand the task and we work on gathering and organizing our ideas. Then there's drafting, where we work to get down get the ideas down on paper as quickly as possible. Then we have a revising stage where we get some feedback or we review the writing later, and we focus on making the content better. We might make changes about the order, things that are unnecessary, we might take them out. We might add things that are missing. So it's focusing on the big pieces, the content. Then we go through an editing phase where we fix the spelling, grammar, punctuation, the mechanics of the writing, and then we publish it. And this looks like a very linear process, but it's not always so linear. It doesn't always go from pre-writing to publishing. Sometimes if we get stuck, we need to add some material. We might go back to brainstorming, for example, and brainstorm that new content and then draft it and revise it again. So sometimes it's very non-linear, but basically we can divide it into these 5 steps. Let's take a look at each of them one by one. So in pre-writing, the first step is just understanding the task. What's the purpose? What's the audience? Who is it being written for? Who's going to be reading this writing? And why are they reading it? Is it for information? Is it for entertainment? Is it to send them some message or convince them of something? So what should the tone be? If we understand the audience, what should the tone be? Is it friendly and informal, or should it be formal? So we need to make these kinds of decisions as a writer. And then what is the structure? So this relates to the genre. What kind of genre are we going to be using? What kind of format are we going to be using? And what are the parts of that, the conventional parts? And what is the aim of each part? And the last one, what genre are we using, and what's the kind of common language or common conventions, language conventions and also structural conventions of that particular genre? After we have made those decisions about the audience and the genre and the tone, we can look at developing ideas, getting ideas together, and that can come from different sources. So the aim here is to just get the content together that will be included in the writing. And like Roger was talking about in the first presentation today, there's kinds of different hats that we can wear when we're brainstorming. There's the dreamer that just comes up with ideas, even if they're illogical or they don't make any sense. They're just kind of generating ideas from the air, from random, pulling ideas out of space, in inner space. So that's the voice that we have to focus on during brainstorming. We shouldn't be evaluating, we shouldn't be organizing our ideas. We should be just coming up with as many ideas as possible. So we shouldn't be evaluating, we shouldn't be using those other voices. So there's lots of methods that we could be using. And also it could be done individually. It could also be done with peers, with a group, or with a partner. Or it could be done with the whole class with the teacher. I think it all depends on the level of the students and how familiar they are with using these kinds of techniques. If brainstorming is new for them, if they've never done brainstorming before, they definitely need your assistance, your coaching. So maybe it should be done as a teacher-led activity. But if they're more familiar, maybe they could be doing it in a small group or with a peer. And if they're very familiar, it could be done individually. So some other ways of gathering information, we could do self-directed research. So you say, for example, that task about, write about your favorite animal. Obviously, they need to gather information, so they need to be doing some kind of research. And you could get them to do that on their own or with a partner or with a small group, using library books or using the internet. You could also give them some input. So for example, if you wanted to get them to write about a particular topic or make some arguments for or against a certain topic, you could show them some video or get them to listen to a podcast or give them some kind of input that gives them ideas they could use in their writing, either for or against that point. Wafa says, one more thing, during the pre-writing stage and even before brainstorming ideas, students had better be provided with a model of the target genre. Definitely, definitely. That's usually provided right at the beginning. They see the genre that they're going to be producing, and they analyze it. That's kind of the genre process approach. It could be done, the generating ideas could be done by a teacher-led discussion. Just some carefully chosen questions can generate some ideas from the class. Or it could be done with, as we talked about before, pair work or small group work. You could give them a list of questions to explore together as well. These are some of the methods that I had on the slide before. I just wanted to talk about them briefly. So these are tools that we can use for generating ideas. That, as I mentioned, they can be done individually, or they can be done collaboratively also, or they could be done on the board as a teacher-led activity. So one is mind mapping. I think mind mapping is a great way to, at the same time, generate ideas and also see the possible structure that you could take for your writing. So just working very quickly on a piece of paper, sketching out and letting the mind map grow with different ideas. It doesn't mean that you have to use all of the ideas that you write down. It just means using the mind map to kind of generate ideas. Afterwards, you would go through and cross out the ideas that you don't want to use, or maybe add ideas or move them around. So the editing phase is second. The first phase is just generative, just brainstorming. We can also use free writing. Free writing means you get a blank piece of lined paper and you just put your pen on the paper and you just write. You start writing and you don't stop moving your pen. Usually the teacher gives a certain amount of time, maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And during that time, you have to keep your pen moving on the paper. Even if that means writing, I don't know what to write, or blah, 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 or something like that. They just keep their pen writing. Students at first may find this a little bit silly or a little bit unusual, but they'll get used to it and they'll see the value later on. The value of free writing is that sometimes writing is generative. That means the ideas come out of the writing. This one can only be used individually, by the way. Another one that can be used is listing. So this means just maybe in a conversation or during a teacher-led discussion, people are just listing ideas, just making a list. Another one that I've used before is using Post-it notes. There's this idea called the Jamboard. Jamboard just means people can put anything up on the board, pictures or quotes or design ideas or anything that can be stuck onto the board. So I've used Post-it notes before, just hand out different colored Post-it notes to different teams, get them to write ideas on the Post-it notes, and then have different sections of the board where you get them to put their ideas. Then afterwards, you would treat it just like a mind map. You would cross out the ones you don't want to use and organize afterwards. After they've got their ideas, after they've used these techniques to generate some ideas, this is when we organize. So organizing could be done by outlining your passage, or by using a graphic organizer. So both of these methods work very well. I think outlining is a little bit more, a little higher level. It's for maybe intermediate or upper intermediate students. Graphic organizers can be used for any level of students, from beginner up. And there's different complexities of graphic organizers also. You can download them from the internet or make them yourself. The next step, so that's all about pre-writing, where they recognize the task, generate ideas, and organize their ideas. Then we move on to drafting. So drafting means putting the ideas into sentences in an organized way. So the important thing to stress to students is this is just a first draft or a rough draft. It's not perfect and it's not the final version. So the focus should be on fluency, on just expressing ideas, on expressing meaning. And there isn't really a lot of attention given at this stage to accuracy or organization. It's important to kind of get the flow of ideas happening. So what you could get students to work on is just get them to write what they know how to say in English and then fill in the missing vocabulary in their mother tongue, or just leave it blank. That can be one way to kind of get the flow happening a little bit more. The important thing here is the goal is to express meaning, and editing and revising the writing is a separate step. That's actually the next couple of steps. Some students will struggle with this. They'll struggle with the idea of writing a rough draft. They think, oh, it's got to be perfect, or oh, I'm going to show this to people. I don't want to make mistakes and it'll be embarrassing. So some students will struggle with this, especially your, perfectionists in the class. But you got to let them know that nobody's going to mock them for making mistakes on a rough draft, and nobody will even really see this apart from the people they share it with. So here's some tips about how to make drafting more effective. The first one is just use kind of rough paper. Don't get them to do it in a notebook. Get them to use paper that they can just rip out. So I usually use these kinds of yellow legal pads, and I get them to write at the top of the page, rough draft or first draft. This is just like a reminder to them that it's not the final version and that they can make mistakes. As I mentioned, use lined paper, like a pad of paper, or just loose leaf paper. Like in Canada we have 3-hole punched paper. This is perfect. And give them a little bit of time pressure. So give them like 5 or 10 minutes to write their draft, especially if it's just a paragraph. Just give them a very short amount of time so they have some time pressure to write. They're going to not worry about mistakes as much. As I mentioned before, if they can't think of a word or they get mixed up with the grammar, just have them write it in L1 or just leave it blank. They can work on that later. An important thing is get them to double space, use double line spacing. Leave a blank line between each line of writing. The reason is that's the place where people can put comments. They can write the comments in a different color pen. The teacher can do that, or their peers can do that, or they can do it. So we've gone through pre-writing, where they're generating ideas and understanding the task and organizing their ideas, and then we've gone through drafting, where they're getting those ideas into written form on the page in a very rough way. The next step is revising. So revise just means to see again. Again. Visia means to see, to look at. So what this means is we're taking a second look at the writing that we did. The best way to do that is with some time gap, with some delay. So we do the drafting first, we take a break from it, we move away, and then we come back to it later and we read it again, and we can see what we missed, what's not necessary, what's got to be moved around. We can see that much more clearly when we take a break. So the goal here is just improving the passage, the content of the passage. So we focus on adding, removing, moving, and substituting content. So we usually remember that by the acronym ARMS, A-R-M-S, add, remove, move, substitute. So this means making the tone and the style and the kind of the content that flow well and make sure that it's appropriate for the task that we've understood in the first stage. So we don't worry about spelling, grammar, punctuation. Those things are not important at this stage. So there's different ways that we can do revision. We could do it through self-revision, as I mentioned, at a later time. We could do it also by giving our paper to one of our classmates and get some feedback, or we could also get it done by the teacher. I would use combinations of these as well. The more people that look at it, the more opportunities there are for improvement. So here are some, Wafia says that's pure editing. Not editing at this stage. This is just pure revising. So the peers are not looking at spelling and punctuation and the mechanics of the passage. They're just looking at the content. So this is just revising at this stage. So the key questions that we should ask, and we could even write these in a questionnaire or a checklist. Does it achieve its purpose? Is the organization effective? Is there sufficient support? Like if we're making an argument, is the reasoning supported? Are there examples? Is there, there data to support the argument? Is it clear and effective? Like the flow of the ideas and the logic of your ideas, is it clear and does it work? And is there enough variety in the sentence structures? This is something we should also look at. So the important thing here is that for revising, the teacher is not the only source of feedback. It's also useful to get the opinion of a peer, somebody who can read it with fresh eyes and see, take a look at the content and see if it makes sense. And I think peers can do that as well as teachers can. Revising others' writing also trains the students to analyze their own. So by reading the writing of another student, they're training themselves to analyze their own writing. And it builds a sense of audience, so they kind of are more conscious that people are reading their writing. And it also builds collaborative learning. So people are helping each other, they're sharing their knowledge. And the more kind of specific and constructive it can be, the better. So we should focus on giving them a checklist, getting them to write down specific things, not just saying, oh, it's good. That's not useful at all. So it should be very specific and constructive. So one thing I usually tell students is describe the passage, like, oh, it does this and it does this. Give some compliments. This is what I liked about your passage, and then give some suggestions. I think this could be better. And as I mentioned, with lower level students or intermediate students, you could give them a checklist Wafia says they should be trained on how to use the checklist. Definitely. You could go through it, the first few times you could go through it together. You could do it together and explain the checklist first. So here's an example. I put an example on the slide of a peer feedback checklist. This is for revising. It just says a bunch of questions. This is for a little bit higher level students. It's a bunch of questions and just they check yes or no. And then there's a place at the bottom for adding compliments and suggestions. You could make it also, when you first start with peer feedback, just start small. Don't expect them to do something very elaborate or detailed. Get them to start small, maybe with 1 or 2 specific points to check. Like, does the paragraph have a topic sentence and 3 supporting points? They just check that content point, and that's all. You can also get them to have to fill out forms, as we mentioned, and these could also be done anonymously. Like, they don't write their name, they just take a look at they do the feedback, and then they hand it back to the teacher, and the teacher distributes it. So it could be all anonymous. I think it's going to be more honest that way. As Wafa mentioned, you should model it for the class. Maybe the first few times you do peer feedback, you can model that. And then, of course, the second draft is the follow-up. Wafa says we should also work on their social skills so they know how to provide feedback in a constructive way. Definitely. Maybe you could even use that as an opportunity to teach some some language point. For example, I really like this, however, and then make the criticism. I'm running out of time a little bit, so I want to just hurry through this last few stages. Editing, the goal is to put the writing into its final form, to fix the problems with capitalization, usage or grammar, punctuation, and spelling. Usually we use the acronym CUPS to remember those 4 points. And this again can be done with self-editing using a checklist or teacher editing. Unfortunately, that requires a lot of work on your part. And the important point I wanted to make here is use standard editing marks. Insert with a little V, reverse the words with a little S shape. You can find lists of these on the internet. The last point is about, the last stage in the process is about publishing. This is where they share their writing with an audience. That could be classmates, friends, family members, teacher, or people in the community. This promotes, I think it's important to promote real communication, especially with older students, with high school or university students. The more meaningful, and it makes like the learning experience more meaningful and impactful, so they get more out of it and it develops their confidence. So they can write real letters and real emails and really send them to people and get a response. Or they can post on social media. They could, for example, they could write a comment on a video, or they could write a comment on Facebook, or they could do a product review, something that they could say bad things or good things about a product and post it on Amazon, for example. You could also do things like make a digital magazine. These days there's all kinds of Web 2.0 or 3.0 tools like Google Docs, Google Sites, all sorts of things for making microsites and blogs and wikis. All of these are great tools to actually publish finished work. Lena says, please indicate how I use the checklist. I think it depends on the age of the students. I think for low-level students, it should be very simple. Like I gave you this example here. It just says things like, I read my writing 4, this is a self-checklist. I read my writing 4 times. I wrote incomplete sentences. I used capital letters for the start of each sentence. All proper nouns are capitalized, and I used punctuation marks, and I fixed all my spellings. So I think you should have a kind of a list of editing points, and you should build those over time. So as you teach new language, you have new language objectives, or you teach new language features, you should include those on the list. So the point here is just for publishing, make publishing as authentic as possible, and it's going to be more meaningful to the students, and they're going to build their confidence. I just want to talk very quickly about our new writing series that's coming out. It's called Writing Framework, and it applies a lot of these ideas that we've been talking about. So altogether there are 9 books, and they're divided into 3 levels. And it goes through sentence to paragraph writing. Paragraph writing, the second series focuses on paragraph writing and builds their skills with different types of paragraphs. And then it moves on to essay writing in the 3rd level. So in terms of the leveling, the lowest level, the yellow level, is the sentence writing level. That's for grades 3 to 4, and it runs from pre-A1 to A2 level. The intermediate level runs from grades 5 and 6, and it's from A1 to B1 level. And then essay writing is for grades 7 and 8, and it runs from B1 to B2 level, CEFR. The beginner level is out now. You can find information about it on our website, but the intermediate and advanced levels are coming out in a few weeks. They're scheduled for July of this year. These include realistic context and relevant topics, topics that are relevant for your students, depending on the age. They have guided practice with a process approach, so just what we've been talking about. They divide it into 5 stages, and they go through each stage. So each stage is given some guidance, so they learn, they get familiar with the stages. There's development of writing skills, vocabulary, and mechanics, so there's focus on each of these points. And it progresses from personal forms like emails, letters, and recipes in level 1 to more academic forms, more complicated forms like essays in level 3. It has a book-in-book workbook, which is a format that a lot of our teachers really like. So that means the workbook slips into the back of the student book, so they just carry actually one book to class. It includes 21st century skills writing projects, and it has an appendix at the back of the book with grammar reference and sample passages so they can see models for their writing. There's lots of supplemental materials that you can download from our website. So it has, like all of our titles, it has ClassBox for teaching in class and at home. It also has Big Box, which is a learning app that for your students, so they can pre-learn the vocabulary and the structures. You can download the audio word lists, transcripts, worksheets, a syllabus, a 12-week syllabus and a 16-week syllabus, lesson plans like model lesson plans, as well as the full answer key, assessments like unit tests, midterm tests, final tests, a full teacher's guide with teaching suggestions, extra activities, and printable flashcards. So as I mentioned, it goes through those 5 stages from a warm-up, then it goes through pre-writing, drafting, revising, and proofreading. So I'll give you a walkthrough very quickly. The first 2 pages are kind of lead-in or warm-up. So it introduces the topic with a picture and some warm-up questions. Then it does some schema activation where they're answering questions that get them to use vocabulary that they already know about the topic. Then they go to the words to know section where we pre-teach the vocabulary that they might need for the writing. Then they see a model passage, and QR code, you can see the QR code here at the top above the passage. So that's the audio. You can actually just scan that with your phone and play the audio in class, very convenient. There's a little check it box next to the passage where they can, it asks them a very simple comprehension question. Then they sort of dissect the model in the next stage. So this is kind of a copying activity where they're copying out the information into an organizer. So there's a main idea and details organizer for this particular passage. This gets them familiar with that structure so they can produce their own later. Then there's a controlled writing activity where they're taking the model passage and they're actually changing elements of it to create a new one of their own. And it gives them instructions for things to change. Then the next 2 pages are about teaching the language skills. So there's grammar points, like level appropriate grammar points. So in this case, they're learning about prepositions, and then they're learning some punctuation as well. In the higher levels, we move on to things like more stylistic concerns. Then they're also learning writing skills like grammar points as well for constructing sentences. So this is all language-focused learning, and then they move on to writing their own passage. So there's the planning stage, which is part of the pre-writing. Then they go through a guided writing cycle where they're given a model, then they're given a scaffolded process of planning and drafting. So you can see in the box there's like little instructions on the left margin that tells them like what should you put in this section. Then there's a little checklist like did you include And those checklists focus on language points that they've learned in the unit. So this is the unit, it's 8 pages long. Then in the workbook, there's more practice with the language points, so you could assign this for homework, for example. And then there's a page where they can do their final draft, and that can be used as a portfolio page. I think somebody in the comments mentioned portfolio. This can be detached or cut out of the book and pulled out of the book and used as a portfolio page. For the lower levels, we also include some drawing space, and there's a little checklist, and there's space for the teacher comments as well. I mentioned at the beginning there's also some 21st century skills writing projects. So each book has 5, I believe. So these are writing projects that include 21st century skills like creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. So they're also related to some of the same themes that are found in the units. So if you want more information about Writing Framework, the Writing Framework series, you can visit our website at compasspub.com and just search in the search bar for Writing Framework. And you can look at sample units, and you can take a look at the supplemental materials as well. So thank you very much. I hope you found the presentation useful, and I hope it gave you a good overview of the genre process approaches, and you have some ideas that you can apply in your classroom. And I hope your students really like the activities, and I hope that they learn to love writing. I think you shouldn't be scared of teaching writing. It's not that difficult. It's just something that you need to get used to as a teacher, and your students need to get used to as well. So I hope. I don't see any questions, but anyway, thank you all for your attention, and we'll see you at the next seminar. Thank you very much.